Rick Donnelly watched Hank Tucker walk across the dealership lot in a jacket that had been mended at both elbows and a cap so sun-faded the logo was almost gone, and he felt the same quick certainty he had felt 10 years earlier. The certainty that this was another visit that would end with a handshake, a polite delay, and no sale. The old pickup in the visitor row had rust above both rear wheel wells. The tailgate chain on one side had been replaced with baling twine, and the floor mats were feed sacks cut flat. Rick had built his instincts on details like that. The details had made him money for 20 years. Hank did not come inside to browse. He stepped to the service counter, set down a folded sheet with serial numbers, and asked for one package, a full precision retrofit for his planting and guidance stack, monitors, row control modules, steering valve integration, receiver, and installation. Parts plus shop labor came to $286,000. Rick pulled the quote from the system, turned the screen, and started to explain financing tiers out of habit. 20% down, 7-year equipment note, current rate, monthly payment ladder, paperwork he could have printed in 5 minutes. Hank listened, nodded once, and said he would pay today if they could lock install dates before spring mud. Rick brought the contract folder anyway because that was the script he knew, and he slid the financing disclosure page to the top where customers usually paused. Hank skipped the page, signed the purchase order, and wrote one check for $286,000 from Tucker Family Farms operating account. He wrote in block letters, no flourish, date in the upper corner, memo line filled with the equipment package code. Ruth Tucker had already balanced the account the night before. The check cleared the hidden question in one quiet motion. No lender, no collateral schedule, no field lien filing, no one waiting for credit committee approval. Rick looked from the check to Hank and back again, because memory had rushed in before pride could stop it. In 2014, he had told this same man that his 2001 Combine was dead and not worth throwing money at, had offered $18,000 on trade, had pushed him toward a $300,000 to $12,000 replacement path, had spoken with the easy confidence of a manager who had never had to explain that sentence to a family at an auction. The arithmetic in front of him now did not leave room for interpretation. Hank had liquidity most customers only performed. He had it while still driving the truck Rick would have rejected on appraisal site. Rick did something small and honest that afternoon. He said, "I called that one wrong." Hank gave him a short nod, thanked the parts desk clerk by name, and left with an install calendar in his pocket. He did not explain 10 years of decisions. He did not collect the moment, and he did not stay to let the room adjust around him. The check had already done the talking. To understand why that check existed and why it could exist without debt from 2015 through 2025, the story has to go back to one day in 1987 when Hank was 15 years old and standing in wet grass beside his uncle's machinery line. The auctioneer's cadence stayed with him longer than any sermon ever had. It was fast, almost cheerful, and each number stripped weight from a life that had taken decades to build. His uncle had borrowed to scale, not recklessly, not vainly, simply in the way everyone said was modern and necessary, and when commodity prices rolled over and interest costs stayed high, manageable payments turned predatory. Hank remembered the exact feel of water soaking through his boots, the smell of diesel from idling pickups, and the way grown men avoided eye contact because no one knew what to say, while a good farm dissolved by lot number. That day settled a specific hesitation for him before he was old enough to sign his own note. He had been uncertain about what adulthood in farming required, whether borrowing big was a rite of passage or a trap with better brochures. The auction resolved it. Ownership without leverage became the rule under every later decision, not because he feared growth, because he feared fragility. His philosophy did not come from theory. It came from watching a man lose bargaining power one payment cycle at a time until nothing left on the place belonged to him in the year he needed options most. He met Ruth 3 years later at a county feed co-op meeting where she was auditing grain settlement sheets for a neighboring family. She liked clean ledgers and direct language. He liked that she could spot an input pricing error in 30 seconds and ask for a corrected ticket without raising her voice. They married, rented for several years, custom-cut wheat for cash, rebuilt small engines at night, and pooled every surplus dollar into an account they called reserve, long before they owned enough acres to justify the term. By 1998, they had enough to make the first purchase that mattered. 160 acres and one used combine, both bought without borrowed money. The land cost $176,000, paid by cashier's check at closing after 6 seasons of savings and side work. Their first combine, a used unit with higher separator hours than any dealer would recommend, cost $42,000 in cash from the same reserve system. The machine came with cosmetic issues, mismatched panels and an owner's manual stained by hydraulic oil. It also came without a lender claim on title. That distinction was the point. If income dipped 1 year, they could keep operating. If prices dropped 2 years, they could still negotiate from a position that did not include repossession risk. Ruth built discipline into a habit that felt ordinary at first and decisive later. Every repair invoice, every bearing set, every hose crimp, every gallon of hydraulic fluid went into a ledger line with date, machine hours, field conditions, and who performed the work. She tracked cash reserve monthly to the dollar and tracked deferred wants as carefully as paid bills, because delayed spending is invisible unless someone records it. Their friends saw patched coats and old equipment and assumed strain. Ruth saw a balance sheet accumulating optionality. Hank saw a wife turning restraint into data he could trust under pressure. A first sequence of years showed how their method worked before anyone outside the house noticed. In 1999, they spent $5,300 on wear parts and preventive work, held reserve at $34,000, and skipped a pickup replacement they could have justified. In 2000, they used $12,000 in off-season custom work income to pre-buy seed discounts for spring and reduced per acre cost by $8 across 160 acres. In 2001, they replaced augers and chains for $3,900, extending combine life another harvest. In 2002, drought reduced gross income, reserve dropped to $26,000, and no lender called because no lender had a claim. In 2003, they bought 120 adjacent acres for $156,000 cash after a retiring owner wanted certainty over top bid. Each line in that sequence solved a practical obstacle before it became a crisis. Lower input costs in 1 year funded repairs in the next. Repairs prevented forced replacement. Forced replacement was what pulled many operators into debt timing they did not control. By 2006, with acres expanded and harvest windows tightening, Hank faced a new bottleneck: parts availability for older equipment families. Dealer shelves favored newer model support. Waiting for a discontinued assembly during peak harvest could cost days they did not have. He resolved that obstacle by buying a second salvage combine for $24,000 and starting a system that looked obsessive from the outside and surgical from inside his shop. Maria Velasquez entered the story there as owner of a regional salvage yard. 2 counties over where rows of donor machines sat organized by manufacturer, platform, and driveline family. Maria knew what would interchange and what would only pretend to fit. She could walk past 5 feeders and tell a caller which gearbox spline count matched a 2001 platform year series without opening a catalog. Hank brought her serial numbers and coffee. She brought him realism and parts that could be trusted. Their working rule was strict: same manufacturer platform years where possible, matching driveline families always, no optimistic adapters that might fail under load when corn moisture ran high. From 2006 forward, Hank cataloged assemblies like a librarian who expected a storm. He logged feeder house components, unloading system parts, hydrostat pieces, final drive units, cleaning shoe alternatives, and cab electronics that were backward compatible within platform limits. The system reduced uncertainty. When failure happened, he could pull known good parts from inventory and machine what needed machining, without waiting on a dealer truck that might not arrive before weather changed. People in town called it scrounging. Ruth called it inventory insurance, and her ledger eventually showed the same pattern year after year: lower capital outlay, higher control, slower visible change, stronger survival margin. By 2014, the machine at the center of everything was his 2001 combine, still running, still earning, still judged by neighbors as one big breakdown from retirement. Harvest prep that summer exposed a serious issue in the drivetrain and separator stack. Dealer labor rates put the repair path into territory Rick Donnelly considered irrational. When Hank brought the machine in for evaluation, Rick used plain terms and no malice. That combine is dead. Dead in his framework meant economically dead at dealer labor rates, not physically impossible to repair. The quote he printed gave one clean route: replace with a comparable unit at a cash price of $312,000. Trade value on Hank's current machine, $18,000. Rick's proposal would have required a decision Hank had never made. With 20% down, the initial cash outlay stood at $62,400, and financing the remaining $249,600 over 7 years at prevailing equipment terms, near 5.25% produced payments of approximately $43,000 annually. In strong years, those payments were manageable. In weak years, they narrowed choices sharply. Hank stood at the edge of a sunk-cost hesitation, uncertain whether fighting for old iron was discipline or denial. Rick's dismissal resolved that hesitation in one sentence because it clarified the underlying disagreement. Replacement assumed stable cash flow. Rebuilding assumed volatility and prioritized control, and Hank drove home that evening committed to a self-rebuild path with no trade and no note. Hank declined trade, called Maria from the lot, and asked her to source 2 donor combines with matching driveline families that could feed one upgraded hybrid build around his 2001 chassis. She found one in Kansas with rear-end damage and intact threshing components for $37,000, and one in Nebraska with cab fire damage and healthy powertrain assemblies for $27,000. Total donor cost came to $64,000 delivered. Hank brought all 3 machines into his shed, stripped them to assemblies, tagged every reusable part, and sent selected pieces to a local machine shop for precision work that would make fitment reliable under field stress. Machine shop and additional parts costs reached $28,600 across 9 months, including shaft machining, bearing housings, updated sensors, harness integration, and fabricated brackets for improved service access. Ruth posted every invoice. Total rebuilt, combined cost basis settled at $92,600, exactly $219,400 below the comparable replacement cash price of $312,000 from the same year. The dollar gap mattered, but the larger win sat in timing control. He spent when and where the bill required, no fixed payment schedule outside his own operation, no lender deadlines overlapping harvest weather. Skepticism arrived immediately because skepticism was rational. A hybrid machine assembled from donor units invites one hard question: can it survive pace when rain compresses harvest into a short window? Hank did not answer with speeches. He answered with operating hours, downtime logs, and repair entries. The first full harvest after the rebuild did not go perfectly. No harvest does, yet it stayed in the field long enough to clear acres on schedule. That outcome resolved community doubt just enough to open the next test: whether reliability could hold across a decade, and not only one season with luck. The 10-year repair ledger from 2015 through 2024 became the evidence. In 2015, repairs totaled $6,800, mainly preseason adjustment and one sensor replacement. In 2016, repairs were $8,900 after a wet crop-bearing issue. In 2017, repairs were $10,400 with a feeder chain and unload auger rebuild. In 2018, repairs fell to $7,600. In 2019, repairs rose to $11,200 after a rough corn year. In 2020, repairs were $9,500. In 2021, repairs reached $12,300 with a hydrostat component refresh. In 2022, repairs were $8,700. In 2023, repairs were $9,900. In 2024, repairs were $7,700. Total over 10 years, $93,000. Annual average, $9,300. That ledger resolved the open thread hanging over the rebuild because uptime tracked with cost. The machine maintained approximately 96% harvest time availability across those seasons. It never required an emergency rental combine, and no harvest season ended with Tucker acres left standing past the weather window because of combine failure. Comparable replacement would have delivered newer technology and warranty comfort. No one denied that. Hank's path delivered lower capital exposure and preserved liquidity through years when cash flexibility created opportunities no warranty could provide. Opportunity arrived almost on schedule because commodity prices softened through 2015 to 2019, and leverage started to squeeze operators whose debt assumptions had been built in stronger markets. Earl Bishop lived that squeeze from the inside. Earl was competent, hardworking, and respected for covering acres fast with modern equipment. His expansion had relied on financed machinery and land leverage during better years, the common playbook in his county. By 2015, he was carrying machinery notes with annual obligations near $140,000 in land debt that had made sense at earlier grain prices. Margin compression turned those obligations from routine to exhausting. Earl did not fail because he was careless. He failed because timing turned against a structure that required consistent income and offered little room when consistency vanished. Hank's structure looked slower in boom years and stubborn in conversations, yet it behaved differently under the same pressure. Debt carried by Hank from 2015 through 2025 remained zero. That single fact changed every negotiation he entered. When retailers offered early buy discounts on fertilizer in weak demand windows, he paid cash and reduced unit costs. When landlords wanted certainty over optimistic bids, he could commit without bank contingency clauses. When weather cut yields, he adjusted spending in season because no fixed lender payment dictated the month. The philosophy was visible now through action, not argument, and each choice pushed the operation one step further from fragility. A second financial sequence during the down cycle shows cause and effect across years with concrete texture. In 2015, corn sold near $3.70 in his local market. Hank delayed a non-essential grain leg upgrade and preserved $40,000 in reserve. In 2016, Seed Reps offered a cash discount tier that saved $11 per bag on a large order. He paid up front and cut spring cost materially. In 2017, a retired couple offered 60 acres for lease with moderate cash rent. If a tenant would maintain terraces, he accepted and held the ground. In 2018, heavy spring rain drove custom drying demand. His paid-off setup processed neighbor grain and generated off-season margin. In 2019, repair costs jumped, reserve absorbed them, and no operating note was open. That sequence opened the next stage. Controlled expansion without land purchase debt. Hank and Ruth added owned acres only when retained earnings could carry full purchase price and working capital after closing. They refused the common trap of buying ground with no cash left for operations. In 2010, before the down cycle fully set in, they had bought 180 acres from an estate for $414,000 cash, taking owned total to $460,000. In 2016, they bought 140 acres at an estate sale for $504,000 cash, lifting owned total to $600,000. Those deals looked conservative in hot years and durable in low-margin years. Earl's pressure intensified into restructuring by 2020. Lenders consolidated collateral, machinery sales covered less than projected, and his owned acres were sold out of family control, in a process that felt clinical on paper and personal in every other way. Hank had a choice at that point that resolved another obstacle: labor continuity during expansion. He could lease those acres and replace Earl, or lease those acres and keep Earl working. He chose the second path. Hank secured a lease on 120 acres that had been Earl's own ground, added them to his operating footprint, and hired Earl as paid farm manager at $68,000 per year, plus a yield-linked bonus structure, which turned Earl's downfall into the exact self-rebuild path the county thought was impossible. Work retained, skills retained, assets not stripped for spectacle. That decision did two things at once. It protected local employment for a man whose knowledge still mattered, and it stabilized Hank's own labor planning as acres increased. Sympathy in this story is not decorative. It changes outcomes. Earl moved from owner risk to wage stability with dignity intact, and the farm retained operator experience that spreadsheets rarely price correctly. Community conversations softened after that season because people saw the difference between extracting advantage and building continuity. Hank still looked like the same frugal mechanic in old coveralls. The social reading around him started to shift one concrete choice at a time. By 2021, retained earnings plus years of controlled spending allowed another owned land purchase, 220 acres for $1,034,000, paid without debt. Owned acreage moved from 600 to 820. The following year brought the other sympathetic casualty in a different form. Caleb Jensen, younger, technically skilled, and trapped by operating debt rather than long-term land notes. Fertilizer prices had jumped, fuel costs were elevated, and his bank line renewal came with tighter conditions after a thin season. He faced a foreclosure risk cascade where one missed operating cycle could cost both tenancy and equipment. Caleb had not mismanaged his farm. He had run hard into a financing structure that punishes narrow margins quickly. His operating line pressure created a specific obstacle Hank could resolve: access to affordable working capital without predatory urgency. In 2022, Hank issued a private operating note for $120,000 at 0% interest over 3 years, fully documented, signed with a clear repayment schedule and tax reporting in place. Terms were straightforward: $40,000 due each year after harvest in 2023, 2024, and 2025, with transparent books and shared crop planning meetings each quarter. The note did more than replace bank stress. It opened mentorship through capital, which is harder than mentorship through advice because money tests trust faster than words. Caleb used the note to clear the high-pressure operating obligation, which resolved his near-foreclosure thread in practical terms by keeping his family tenancy and equipment in place for the next planting cycle. He hit the first $40,000 repayment on schedule in 2023 after disciplined cost control and a better-than-feared yield. He made the second $40,000 payment in 2024 with no reminder call from Hank. By the end of 2025, he paid the final $40,000, full principal returned, no interest charged, relationship intact. While these personal turns played out, the rebuilt combine kept doing the quiet work that had once been dismissed as impossible economics. During compressed harvest weeks, it stayed available, and when failures appeared, they were understood failures with known remedies, from inventory or Maria's yard. Her role evolved from supplier to collaborator. She reserved compatible assemblies when she heard of auctions, called Hank before listing high-demand components, and received his retired usable pieces in return to support other operators with older platforms. Their partnership demonstrated a practical truth. Resilience in agriculture often looks like networks of competent people sharing technical memory across county lines. In 2023, Hank and Ruth made the final owned land addition needed to reach their long-planned footprint: 120 acres purchased for $684,000 from an absentee owner exiting the region. Owned acres reached 940. Cash-rented acres stood at 180 by 2025, including Earl's former 120 and another 60 under a maintenance-focused lease. The operation now balanced owned stability and rented flexibility without debt pressure. Scale had arrived quietly and late, exactly as their philosophy predicted: slower in public view, stronger in adverse years, and financed by retained earnings rather than borrowed optimism. That set the stage for the 2024 dealership scene, where appearance and arithmetic finally collided in public. Rick had spent a decade watching newer paint move through financing channels, while Hank kept running a machine once declared economically dead. The check for $286,000 did not make Hank rich in that moment. It revealed liquidity that had been accumulating for years under choices many people misread as limitation. Rick's retraction mattered because it was specific. He had called the combine path wrong in 2014, and in 2024 he said so without excuses. The room adjusted around that sentence faster than it had around any rumor. Hank still did not lecture. He took install dates, thanked the service writer, and went home to grease fittings before rain. Ruth entered the purchase in the ledger the same evening under capital improvements, noted cash outflow, projected tax treatment, and updated reserve targets for the next 12 months. Their method remained unchanged despite the public reversal, because methods that survive stress rarely need theatrics after validation. They had one more question to resolve by 2025, legacy beyond their own balance sheet, and that question moved them from private resilience to community transfer. By late 2025, their net worth measured $3,860,000. The composition was grounded and plain. Land equity on 940 owned acres represented the largest share, equipment, and stored grain added operating value. Cash reserves remained healthy after capital purchases, and liabilities sat at zero. Net worth in this context was not a trophy number. It was the arithmetic record of a philosophy tested through drought pressure, low commodity cycles, equipment aging curves, and local skepticism. Every dollar in that number connected to a choice made earlier when the easier social option would have been spending for appearance. They chose to convert part of that capacity into a permanent tool for younger operators. Hank and Ruth funded a $250,000 local agriculture scholarship endowment in 2025 through the County Foundation, structured to support students in diesel technology, precision agriculture systems, agronomy, and farm business accounting, with a requirement that recipients complete paid internships on working farms in the region. The endowment targeted practical competence, the same kind that had carried their own operation. Annual distributions were calibrated to preserve principle and create recurring awards instead of one-time publicity. They wanted continuity, not a headline cycle. The scholarship resolved a final tension in Hank's story, whether a private philosophy could outlive the person who practiced it. It can when converted into institutions with clear rules. Ruth set eligibility metrics, reporting standards, and renewal conditions with the same precision she used in farm books. Hank added one informal criterion during interviews. Applicants had to explain one repair they had done themselves and one financial decision they regretted. The question filtered for humility and practical thinking, two traits they trusted more than polished resumes. The first cohort was selected before winter set in, and local shops had placement requests within weeks. Every named person in the story reached a specific place by the end, none of it clean, all of it real. Rick Donnelly remained dealership sales manager, and after the 2024 check, he changed how he framed older equipment decisions with customers, offering repair economics with clearer assumptions and less certainty theater. He publicly retracted his 2014 dismissal at a winter grower meeting when discussing life cycle costs, saying Hank's rebuild forced him to revisit his own model. Maria Velasquez expanded her salvage operation with stronger demand for vetted compatible parts, and her long-term supply relationship with Hank became a reference standard for other operators pursuing debt-light maintenance strategies. Earl Bishop continued as paid farm manager on the acres he once owned. A transition that still hurt on hard days and still paid bills on time, and that continuity is the direct resolution of his downfall thread from 2020 rather than a quiet disappearance from the story. By 2025, he had rebuilt household stability, reduced personal liabilities, and regained a professional rhythm without lender calls dictating his calendar. His children stayed in the local school district, and he coached spring baseball again, details that do not show on restructuring documents and matter anyway. Caleb Jensen completed repayment of the $120,000 zero-interest note on schedule, kept tenancy, and entered 2026 with cleaner books and lower financing pressure than at any point since he started farming. Hank Tucker ended where his 15-year-old self had pointed him, debt-free on owned ground, still wearing repaired jackets, still driving trucks until repair arithmetic said stop, still uninterested in performing wealth for people who judged it by paint color. The rebuilt 2001-based hybrid combine that was declared dead in 2014 had carried 10 harvest cycles under his maintenance system, with $93,000 in total repairs from 2015 through 2024 and an annual average of $9,300. The exact ledger Ruth could pull from a shelf in under a minute. The machine had not been magical. It had been managed. Ruth Tucker ended as co-architect of everything the public called Hank's discipline. She tracked the numbers, guarded reserves when spending pressure rose, validated each repair versus replace choice with records instead of mood, and converted late-life capacity into the $250,000 endowment that will keep training local talent long after their own acres change hands. Her work never looked dramatic in the moment. It compounded exactly the way interest compounds, quietly, relentlessly, and only obvious to outsiders when the total gets too large to ignore. The county still has shiny equipment on financed notes, old equipment on borrowed time, careful operators, overextended operators, lucky seasons and hard ones, all the usual parts of rural economics that never flatten into a single moral. Hank's story never argued that everyone who borrowed was foolish, because many good farmers borrowed for reasons that were rational when they signed. The story argued something narrower and stronger. Debt timing decides who has options when weather, prices, and lenders line up against them. Hank and Ruth kept options by refusing machinery debt, documenting every decision, and accepting slower social validation in exchange for higher long-run control. When people retell the dealership scene now, they still mention the check first because checks are easy symbols. The deeper reversal sat elsewhere. In 2014, Rick called a 2001 combine dead under dealer economics, and his statement was internally consistent. Hank accepted the diagnosis and changed the economics through a self-rebuild path that started the same week with donor sourcing and ended 10 years later with proven uptime. He sourced 2 donor combines for $64,000, spent $28,600 on parts and machine shop work, built 1 hybrid at $92,600 cost basis, carried 0 debt from 2015 through 2025, absorbed average annual repairs of $9,300, and preserved enough liquidity to write a $286,000 check in 2024 without financing paperwork. Arithmetic corrected the record while everyone kept talking about appearances. That is why the old truck still confuses strangers at the coffee counter, and why Hank does not bother correcting them. He already knows what his numbers are doing next season, what acres are paid for, what leases are stable, what repairs are scheduled, and which scholarship applicants need work boots before internship starts. Public image remains noisy and short-lived. Ledgers stay quiet and cumulative. Hank trusted the second one since he was 15, and by 2025 the county could read the result without being told what to think.